Good morning, everybody. Lovely to see so many smiling faces. I'd like to introduce Liselotte Kastner, Liesel, who has had a fascinating life, and I think you'll all be very interested in it. She started off in Vienna and went off to Edinburgh and spent all of her youth in Edinburgh. And then Oxford, the National Youth Orchestra as a cellist, and then back to Vienna. And she's been a member of Southampton for many years, as have her husband and 3 sons, who are now all back in England. And I think we'll have a very interesting morning. Over to you, Liesel.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, Gillian and Tom, for the invitation. It's rather daunting to speak after so many wonderful talks in your series, but I'll try my best. I was born in July 1934 in Vienna. I was the only child of my parents, Ernst Adler, doctor, and Regina Capella Adler, biochemist. My father, born in 1899 in Vienna, his father, Emil Adler, was the executive head of the Israelitische Kultusgemeinde Wien, that is the Council of the Jewish Community, at a time where there were 200,000 Jews living in Vienna, that is 10% of the population. Emil's father, my great-grandfather, Salomon, was a doctor, Stadtarzt in Porlitz, a small town in Moravia, in the Czech, well, it wasn't a republic in those days, a province of the Czechoslovakia. In the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, he erected a field hospital where he treated the wounded soldiers, also of the enemy, and received, after the very brief war, a personal handwritten letter from Kaiser Wilhelm I. Sadly, the letter doesn't exist anymore today. But it was something to be thanked by the Kaiser on the other side. He had a respected position. He was a Hebrew scholar and strictly observant. My father's mother's family came from Erlach, a village about 70 kilometers south of Vienna. And my great-grandfather, Simon Hacker, was a wine merchant. He built a synagogue, a small synagogue on his land adjacent to his house. And all the Jewish people in his village and the surrounding villages came there. There was a service every Shabbat, of course, on Yontiv. And if somebody had a yahrzeit, I think a child in the village would go around on a bicycle trying to drum up a minyan. You can therefore see that in Austria and also Czechoslovakia, the Jews in villages and small towns, they did not live in a shtetl. There was no klezmer music or a fiddler on the roof atmosphere. That's a fallacy. They were often middle-class professionals and were totally integrated in the community of the village, but at the same time practicing Orthodox Jews. This had implications, of course, when it came then to the Anschluss, because it was very much harder even for those Jews to escape than perhaps those in the cities. My father was an excellent student in medicine. He held numerous junior positions in the famous Wenkebach Clinic, internal medicine at the University Hospital, also pediatrics, obstetrics. The trouble was it was very difficult to gain a senior position, and there were few senior positions. And so not only did the Jewish doctors have to contest against anti-Semitism, but infighting amongst the Jewish doctors themselves. So after my parents were married in 1928, my father decided to become a general practitioner because that would give him a stable income. He was a good and popular doctor, and on one occasion doing a house visit, a mother came running and said she'd heard there was a doctor in the house, her child was ill. So my father came to look at the child, who had a serious middle ear infection, which was dangerous in those days because it could often go on to mastoiditis. And the young patient, who did very well under my father's care, fortunately, was a violinist. His name was Norbert Breinin, who later on, as you probably all know, founded the famous Amadeus Quartet. When the Amadeus Quartet came to the Edinburgh Festival for the first time in 1951, my father went backstage and there was a joyful reunion between patient and doctor. And the quartet was then on several occasions guests in our house. My mother was born in 1900 in Stanislau, Galicia, then a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now it's in the Ukraine. Roughly half of the population was Jewish. In 1914, my mother's family moved to Vienna. Her father, Moritz Capella, was descended from the famous Sadagora rabbinic dynasty. He and his three brothers, they were representatives of large shipping lines, the Canadian Pacific and the Royal Mail lines. My grandfather worked mostly in Bucharest. My mother graduated DPhil in chemistry from Vienna University in 1923. It had been very difficult for a girl from an Orthodox family to study, but my mother usually got her way in life, and she studied and succeeded. She was appointed demonstrator first and then lecturer in the Department of Medical Chemistry at Vienna University, quite unusual for a woman in those days. But in 1934, she lost her paid position because she could not pass the bar to become docent. That's roughly senior lecturer. At the end of 6 years in Vienna, if one was not made docent, then one lost one's position. And her chief, who thought very highly of her work, Professor Fürth, said that with her research work, 6 men would have become docent, but as a woman and Jewess, she would not pass the bar. She continued nonetheless her research work and teaching unpaid. She was appointed director of the clinical laboratory of a large private hospital, the Sanatorium Hera, and began studying medicine. In 1933, she published a chemical pregnancy test, which was hailed in the general press as a sensational discovery. My mother had perfected a colorimetric test for histidine, which is excreted throughout pregnancy in the urine. The test is cheap, positive at an early stage of pregnancy, and only takes a few hours, which was quite different to the 5 days required for the biological tests. And above all, no animals were required. My parents were delighted when my mother tested herself and was shown to be positive when I was underway. Life was pleasant for my parents. Concerts, they had a subscription for the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra, they went to the opera, to the theater. In the winter, they went skiing every Sunday to the Raks, that's the mountains closest to Vienna. And throughout the summer months, they would play tennis. My father played the violin. He played in the doctor's orchestra, an extremely good orchestra, and also chamber music. Our home was in the Leopoldstadt, the very Jewish district of Vienna, near the Prater. However, with the Anschluss, March the 11th to the 13th in 1938, everything changed overnight. The restrictive laws against Jews, they were enforced within weeks. My parents both lost their positions, and therefore there was no income. My mother was banned from the university and also from her medical studies. In two-thirds of the doctors in Vienna were dismissed overnight. Can you imagine? I'm surprised. I wonder what the Aryans thought when they all of a sudden only had 1/3 of the doctors that used to be there. 80% of the lawyers were dismissed. Jews could not visit parks, restaurants, then cinema, concerts, and they could only shop in Jewish shops. My mother was shopping once, and in came the Gestapo. She looked very Aryan, and they were trying to drag her already to the window, because the punishment for Aryans who shopped in Jewish shops was that they were put in the window with a huge sign saying, "I have been shopping in this Jewish swine's shop." But she managed to persuade them that she couldn't shop anywhere else. On Yom Kippur, 1938, my mother and her sister were forced, they were taken off the street and were forced to wash the floor in the Gestapo. So my mother set to work. She always did a perfect job, so she demanded for some polish so that she could do her job properly. And a Nazi official then slipped and fell, so they were thrown out very quickly, fortunately, from the Gestapo. There was then a desperate effort on the part of my parents to find a country to move to. The only countries where one could go without a visa were Shanghai or the Dominican Republic. In fact, most countries in the world didn't want us Jews. My father was arrested just hours before the Kristallnacht. He was picked off the street, November 1938, taken to the local police station, and he was packed like sardines in a small room and threatened by the SS guards with guns and the whips. Random victims were selected, and they had to be passed over the shoulders of the crowded Jews and were taken into the courtyard and beaten, and their screams were really heartrending. My father was also beaten up, and my mother then went to her father-in-law and beseeched him to go to his, he was retired by this time from the Kultusgemeinde, to go to his old office and plead that they should ring up the Gestapo. In fact, they didn't want to do this at first, but my grandfather had a heart attack in his old office because he was so upset that the people whom he had trained for their positions to follow him were not listening to him. So in the end, they rang up the Gestapo and said they wanted their doctor. So my father was released after 4 days of imprisonment. Tragically, all the people who were with him were sent to Dachau the very next day, so my father had a very narrow escape. We were saved by my mother's pregnancy test. In Britain, there was a wonderful Society for the Protection of Science and Learning, which was founded in 1933 by Lord Beveridge and Professor A.V. Hill. if one got onto the list of the society, then this was distributed amongst the universities in Britain, so that any professor who had a vacancy could offer these academics who'd first been thrown out of Germany and now from Austria could perhaps find a position in Great Britain. There were about 2,500 on their books, and I think in the end about 1,000 refugee academics found positions through this society. In Edinburgh, there was Professor Crewe. He was the head of the Department of Animal Genetics at Edinburgh University, and he had founded and ran the first and only pregnancy diagnosis laboratory in the whole of Great Britain. So he knew of my mother's pregnancy test and offered her hospitality in his department. At the same time, my father was chosen as one of 50 Austrian doctors who were assured that they would be allowed to practice in Great Britain if they passed the British qualifying exams. Now, there was a race to obtain the obligatory documents, clean police record, no debts, and so many new laws, anti-Jewish laws, had been instituted by the Nazis. So there were tax laws, for instance, imagine paying for the destruction which the Nazi thugs had done on Kristallnacht, thrown the Jews out of their own shops, out of their own houses, and the Jewish population had to pay for this damage. There was a tax on leaving the country and a wealth tax, but at last my parents were able to get all the documents. There was just one more hurdle to entering Britain, and that was everybody needed a guarantor, and my parents knew nobody. However, a daughter of the Haham, Moses Gaster, her name was Henrietta Ryder, and her husband Napoleon guaranteed for my parents. They didn't know us. Perhaps they'd just seen a photograph and liked the photograph and the CV. And my parents were eternally grateful that they offered a guarantee for them. So they packed entirely the entirety of their furniture, all their possessions, my mother, all her documents, my father, his medical instruments, and with virtually no money, hardly a word of English, we set off by train to Hoek van Holland, then by boat to Harwich, arriving in Britain on January the 27th, 1939. My father immediately started work in the Royal Infirmary, Edinburgh. He was shown round by very kind Scottish doctors. My mother started research in Professor Crewe's department and was awarded the prestigious degree of Doctor of Science in 1941 for her work on the metabolism of histidine and histamine in normal and toxemic pregnancy. My mother was extremely interested in the pathology of toxemic pregnancy. It is even today not fully understood and sadly still a cause of maternal mortality and fetal mortality. I was enrolled at the Grange Home School, a small family school, and like all children, learned English very quickly. Indeed, by summer, I had acquired in camp the proletariat Fife accent, and when I came back to school, the whole school spoke this dialect to the horror of the English headmistress. When war broke out in September, the school was evacuated to Cymru in Perthshire. I missed my parents, of course. As enemy aliens, they seldom were able to visit because they required permission from the police to go beyond a radius of 15 or 20 miles from their place of residence. And of course, they had no transport. But I was happy there. I was a tomboy, I climbed trees, I learned to ride a bike, but there were bad memories too. There was an outbreak of jaundice at school, and at first when I was ill, they thought I was faking, and they gave me castor oil. Can you imagine? Horrid. And when I was sick and brought it all up, they gave me another dose. So one remembers things like that for all of one's life. I was oblivious at school of my parents' difficulties at the time. In May 1940, my father, like most of the refugees, was interned on the Isle of Man. There was, of course, a huge fear of Nazi invasion. The Germans had occupied now Denmark and Norway on the east, and then south of Britain, Holland, Belgium, and then finally France. So it was a terrible time. And actually, the Jewish refugees were interned along with Germans who were openly pro-Nazi. There were Scots who kindly vouched for my father, and he was released in September. That's about after 4 months, and immediately took up his medical studies again. My mother was allowed to stay in Edinburgh at this time. All women had to move away from the east coast of Scotland, but my mother and another lady doctor were allowed to stay because my mother was doing work of national importance. So my father qualified in medicine in Britain then in 1941 and started in practice a year later. It was their first home in the United Kingdom, with furniture from Vienna, and wonderful after living in only 1 or 2 rooms in a boarding house until then. The Scottish doctors were very welcoming. On the other hand, there was one refugee doctor from Vienna who had seen the writing on the wall rather earlier than my parents, and had come to Edinburgh already in 1936, and told my father there was no room for a second refugee doctor in Edinburgh. Socially, my parents had 3 circles of friends. There were the Jewish friends. They especially appreciated my parents going on a Shabbat afternoon to the open house of Rabbi Salis Deiches, the wonderful rabbi of Edinburgh at the time, and his wife Flora. The Jewish community was generally welcoming to my parents because my father participated very actively in the Jewish community, whereas one can't say that of all the other, of their attitude to the other the refugees who generally were assimilated and did not participate. The second group of friends then were the refugees, mostly assimilated, as I said, and academic. It was Professor Max Born, the famous physicist, Nobel Prize winner, and excellent pianist, and a lovely man. He played sonatas with my father, and on 1 or 2 occasions, and they were guests in our house. There was Professor Isidor Traube, formerly professor of chemistry at the Technische Hochschule Berlin, who came to Edinburgh University in 1934. Also a lovely man who didn't have family in Edinburgh, and he sometimes took me as if I was his granddaughter to buy a toy for me in a shop. There was Dr. Hans Gahl, composer, music historian, who also had a position at Edinburgh University. He was one of the founders of the Edinburgh Festival and instrumental in bringing the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra under the great Bruno Walter to the very first Edinburgh Festival. And my father was asked to be the honorary doctor to the Vienna Philharmonics. And indeed, he had a few patients, because although we had rationing in Britain, we still were eating a lot better than the Viennese at the time. And several of them got tummy pain. There was Dr. Ernst Levin from Germany, neurologist, and Professor Dr. Erwin Stengel from Vienna, who was a psychiatrist and later became professor of psychiatry at Sheffield. They and their wives were visitors. And in the cruise department, there was Charlotte Auerbach, who was a great friend, of course, of my mother's, because they both worked in the same department. And Charlotte Auerbach became a very famous geneticist. She discovered the mutant effect, the first time there was such an effect of mustard gas shown, that it damaged the chromosomes of the Drosophila fly. Now, this was secret work during the war. She could only publish her paper after the war. There were the Türk sisters from Germany, who had a rival open house for the refugees, which I was often taken along to because, of course, my parents never had a babysitter. Then there were the former friends, doctors from Vienna, who lived in England, but came to Edinburgh to take the triple qualification or the higher membership and fellowship exams. My mother invited them for dinner and somehow managed. There was only one gas ring in each of their 2 rooms, but she cooked a nice meal for them. Then there was the Polish Medical School in Edinburgh. This was a unique institution in the United Kingdom. Polish students were able to study in their own language, taught by Polish professors, and then were allowed to practice without taking further exams in Britain. The dean was Professor Jacob Rostowski, neurologist, a great friend of my parents, and they often invited him because his wife had got stuck in Russia before the war and was in Siberia. So he was a frequent and loved visitor. He did not profess to be Jewish, but my mother knew he was Jewish. And indeed, after he retired, he had a second career as a wonderful sculptor, and his Jewish soul then came out in his work. I saw a wonderful sculpture he'd done of Auschwitz survivors. The third circle of my parents' friends were the Scottish friends. They were mostly doctors, but also musicians who played with my father and other professions too. Once my father was established in practice, I was brought home at last to Edinburgh. I was 8 3/4 years old. I was enrolled at George Watson's Ladies' College, an excellent independent school, which was huge in comparison to the Grange Home School. At last, I could have a proper Jewish life again. I accompanied my father every Shabbat to synagogue. I have memories of the wonderful chazan, that was Reverend Zucker, who sang the most beautiful Unisana Talkef that I have ever heard all my life. Please forgive my old-fashioned Ashkenazi pronunciation. Then there was the butcher, Abraham Lurie, and my memories are that there he stood in his shop with all the women there demanding twice their own rations, and he would have a huge bone in one hand and an even huger knife in the others, and he would say, "You women, you think I can make wheat from nowhere? You all want more than your ration and I haven't got it." And I was really quite scared, but it was quite impressive. Then there were the Seder evenings. My father gave a wonderful Seder. His profound Hebrew knowledge and beautiful voice made it special. Once he brought home some soldiers from Schule and for the Seder, and it got so late that they couldn't get back to the barracks, so somehow they slept on the floor. And then his rendering of a Haftorah, very special to this day, is he always took the Jonah Haftorah on Yom Kippur. And so to this day, I go along always for Mincha, whilst my family is still resting in preparation for returning to Shul for Nile. VE Day, of course, was something incredible, but the joy was tempered for my father because of his anxiety over the fate of his family. His mother survived Theresienstadt, but there was no news of his sister, the middle one of his three sisters. So, tragically, my Aunt Trude and nearly the whole of the large family in Prague were on the last transports in October 1944 from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz and were murdered there. Music was the most important sphere in my life apart from schooling. I had piano lessons with Miss Lovell first, then cello lessons at the wonderful Waddell School of Music in Edinburgh. The sisters Mamie taught the violin and Ruth the cello. They were incredible teachers in the school which had been founded by their father in 1880. There was also the string orchestra, which I played in. But the most exciting development in my life to date arose from the concert, which was given by the National Youth Orchestra, founded only a few years previously by Ruth Railton, at the Edinburgh Festival in 1951. It was just fabulous, and I wrote requesting an audition from Miss Railton. I was ecstatic to be chosen to join for the very next course. In sectionals, we were trained by professors from the Royal Academy in London. So Douglas Cameron was the professor for the cellists. The first full rehearsal was incredible. Sitting there amongst 130 wonderful, wonderful musicians there, it was just an indescribable joy. And at that very first course, I was asked to look after the young soloist, Francis Holmes, who was playing the Mozart piano concerto in C minor, Like an Angel. And we have remained friends to this day. We played great symphonies. On that occasion, it was the New World Symphony, but Brahms, Sibelius, it was very special. Our conductors, distinguished conductors, Sir Adrian Bolt, Walter Susskind, the Czech refugee, Hugo Rignold, and it was a social eye-opener for me. It was the first time I'd come across in close contact with children from all areas of life. So for a year, I sat next to Humphrey, who was at Eton, and his father, had a high position in the Foreign Office. And then, of course, there were the youngsters from poorer homes. We all had music in common and got on well. A climax was the coronation concert in 1953 in the then almost brand new Royal Festival Hall, followed by a week in Brussels, staying with lovely guest families, Belgian guest families. We played the César Franck Symphony in honor of the Belgians, and the concert was attended by the Queen Mother, Elizabeth of Belgium. Also, there was the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto, played by Ralph Holmes, and in the very quietest moment in the introduction between the first and the second, the introduction to the second movement, in between the first and the second movements, To my horror, my cello spike slipped, and everybody could hear this grating sound as it went across the bare floor. I could have sunk into the ground. So rectified the position as best as possible, and the conductor said to me, "Is it all right now?" somewhat angrily. My academic pathway, my parents had instilled in me at a young age gratitude to Britain, and the fact that they felt that their trust in us as a family has to be repaid with exemplary behavior and work ethos. So I tried my best. I got an entrance scholarship for medicine to Edinburgh University, then Oxford, a Carnegie scholarship. I graduated in medicine in 1958 with honors. I was one of the last 2 house physicians of Sir Stanley Davidson, physician to Her Majesty the Queen in Scotland, and then went to Somerville College to read for a DPhil in biochemistry. I was greatly privileged that Sir Hans Krebs, Nobel Prize winner, agreed to be my supervisor. He was a Jewish refugee from Germany, but totally assimilated. So at the first meeting, we had a chat, and then he said to me, "So you'll be starting on Monday?" And I looked at him and I said, "But Sir Hans, Monday is Yom Kippur." So he looked at me and said, "But that must be a huge dilemma for you." It was my turn to look absolutely astonished at him and said, "No, Sir Hans, it's no dilemma for me at all. I will not be here on Monday. I will try and make up the work, though." It was really quite strange. Another thing at Oxford that was very nice, the Shabbat open afternoons at the great Jewish historian's house, Cecil Roth, with his his wife with a great personality, colorful, Irene, and all Oxford Jewish undergraduates knew all of her jangling bracelets. That was her hallmark. I was also invited to hear Cecil Roth reading the Megillah, which was quite an honor. I played in the Oxford University Orchestra and in many varied chamber ensembles in beautiful college halls. I also played in a string quartet for a wedding in the House of Commons in the crypt. The daughter of a member of Parliament was getting married, and we were then invited to the reception afterwards, and I think I had too much champagne on an empty stomach. My parents were concerned that I didn't seem to be in a hurry to get married, so I was sometimes asked to show male visitors around Oxford, but they were generally not interested either in Oxford or me, and I not in them. However, there was Georg Kastner, who was more persistent and returned then, and 6 months later we were engaged. He spoke 6 languages fluently, a smattering of several more, and had an unlimited store of jokes. It's quite useful sometimes to have languages. Shortly after we were married, we were in the car on a mountain road, and as we went round a hairpin bend, all of a sudden the car behind overtook and then decided they wanted to veer off the road in front of our car to the side. Georg slammed on the brakes, stopped the car, and screamed at the man in French because it had a Belgian number plate, the car. The swarthy man who got out then let out a torrent of rude Turkish. My husband immediately shot back with very rich swear language in Turkish. And I still remember the look on the man's face, his mouth wide open like that, staring at this European in the Viennese car as we left. Georg lived in Vienna. He was an economics graduate of the university and worked in export business. He'd worked in Tel Aviv for a year, in New York for a year, but always gravitated back to Vienna. He later requalified as a chartered accountant and tax advisor, a profession which he loved. His family background was that he'd grown up in Bratislava. His father, Lajos, was a prominent member of the Orthodox community there. Lajos was an unsung hero in the rescue of Jews from the Holocaust. He and his childhood friend, Aaron Grunhut, jointly organized and personally supervised the Danube Express in summer 1939, transporting 1,365 Jews, plus a baby born then en route. The Jews were from Central Europe, and they were transported in 2 small Danube steamboats initially to Sulina in Romania, and then by a large boat to Haifa, landing Erev Yom Kippur just after the outbreak of World War II. The journey took nearly 12 weeks. It was so fraught with the huge problems which the 2 men successfully had to overcome. They are commemorated in a plaque in the yeshiva of Pressburg in Jerusalem. Their family escape was incredible. Lajos was tipped off in spring 1942 by a business acquaintance who happened to be a high-ranking Nazi and knew that there would be the first roundup of Jews on that day. So told his friend that he had to leave in 2 hours. The family escaped across the border and stayed for a few days with relatives in Hungary, and then on to Budapest, where the family stayed illegally for a year, which was dangerous. So after Pesach, just after Pesach 1943, they took the train via Sofia to Istanbul, and arriving safely after quite a treacherous journey. Georg celebrated his bar mitzvah a few weeks later at the Ashkenazi synagogue there, and then he and his sister were enrolled at the English school in Istanbul, which they loved. Some of the teachers were in fact spies for Britain and used the fact they were teaching just as a shield. Lajos continued his work in saving Jews there and did manage to, he had success in a few cases. He met Joe Brandt whilst he was in Istanbul and had several discussions with him. You may all remember that, to have heard that Joe Brandt was the person who was called by Eichmann, who offered to save 1 million Jews, Hungarian Jews, from Auschwitz in exchange for 10,000 lorries, blood for goods, and wanted Joe Brandt to negotiate with the British about this. Lajos also met Cardinal Roncalli in Istanbul, who was the papal nuncio to Turkey. He later became Pope John the 23rd. He helped in many ways to save Jews. He was a wonderful man. And he also promoted Christian-Jewish understanding, especially during the Second Vatican Council. The Kastner family then returned to Europe in 1949 and settled in Vienna. Georg and I were married in August in 1963 in Edinburgh. My parents would have never gone back to Vienna to live there. My father was well established, respected by patients and by his colleagues and the consultants in hospital alike. My mother had been appointed lecturer in clinical chemistry in 1951 at Edinburgh University. She was internationally known and respected and called affectionately the histamine queen, as a play on her name Regina, by the exclusively male researchers in her field. I was totally unprepared for the culture shock I would get on living in Vienna, because my mentality was totally British. Vienna is one of the most beautiful cities in the world, with magnificent buildings, sumptuous concert halls, the beautiful opera house, elegantly dressed women, all impressive exterior. Where is the inner soul? It's nowhere to be found. The people look bitter, never a smile. I think that in throwing out the Jews, Vienna had become provincial. My first blow was that Vienna University would not recognize my Edinburgh medical degree. The arrogance with which Vienna Medical School still thought that they were the great school that they had been pre-World War II, before they had thrown out over 50% of the senior medical staff overnight in 1938, was incredible. They did not want to recognize only a bachelor's degree, which is the usual degree in Britain, as equivalent to their then really very poor doctorate. It was an insult to Edinburgh University. However, Professor Brooker, the professor of pharmacology, offered me a temporary lectureship in his department on the basis of my Oxford DPhil, which they couldn't fail to recognize. The second blow was my difficulty in entering the musical world. The academic orchestra was totally unwelcoming when I tried to play in it. A colleague invited me, and several of the ensembles he played in did ask me to play, but it was always just when they needed an extra cello, and it was sometimes when they were desperate somebody had let them down. But his brother-in-law, Erich Boltenstern, architect and actually the son of the architect who had redesigned the interior of the opera house in Vienna, which was gutted by a bomb in the last few days of the war. That was a lovely family. Erich and his wife invited us every year for New Year's Eve, so we brought in the New Year with chamber music, which was a very special thing and unusual. But in general, everything was on a very formal basis as regards social interaction in Vienna. The third blow was the Jewish community. After all, I felt I belonged in view of the high position my grandfather had held. Whilst very few of the community in post-war Vienna originated from Vienna originally. I was not interested in a fashion competition, and they probably were bored to tears by me. But the Hasanut, which was handed down in Vienna from Salomon Sulzer, the famous Chazan in the 19th century who'd been a friend of Schubert's, that was very special. The only happy social contact that we had in Vienna was with my, as I called them, my substitute parents. A school friend of my mother's, Jenny, had married Ernst Morawetz, who was the leader of the viola section of the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra and had been the viola player in the famous Rosé Quartet. He protected his Jewish wife throughout World War II. It was possible sometimes to survive if a prominent Aryan refused to divorce his spouse or her spouse, then it was possible sometimes to survive. It wasn't easy, but it was possible to survive as a Jew in Vienna. They looked on me as a daughter. We were often invited. We got one ticket for the Vienna Philharmonic subscription concert, which was held always on a Sunday morning. But this was a social event for the Viennese and not a musical event. And I sometimes I just wanted to shake the audience because they weren't interested in the music. They only wanted to get up in the interval and greet as many people as they possibly could. And the only person who seemed to be different was the famous soprano Irmgard Seyfried, who sat diagonally opposite me and was obviously living in the music, and it was a joy to see her smiling and loving the music. It became obvious to me that the social problems I had in Vienna were not due to anti-Semitism. I must stress that. I never once heard an anti-Semitic remark, at least to my face, all the years I was there. However, I was classified as a stranger and therefore excluded. My family, we had 3 sons, wonderful sons, all born in Edinburgh because I wanted to ensure that they had British citizenship. And I also wanted good obstetric care because the antenatal care I'd had in Vienna was actually malpractice. They went to the English school, lovely English school in Vienna, kindergarten, then primary school. And I made my best friends, or my first friends, in Vienna amongst the mothers of the children at school there. And all the British mothers told me that they'd had the same difficulties with the Austrians socially. My kids, they were loud and lively, and they were always in trouble with the neighbors, but they looked angelic with their blonde curls. So I think one couldn't get too cross with them, or at least I couldn't. They half killed each other, so I was a frequent visitor to the emergency and accident hospital. But now they are as thick as thieves, and it is heartwarming how they help each other with their varied skills, each helping the other. We sent them to Carmel College then for their secondary education because we wanted them to have a Jewish education, which was not possible at the time in Vienna. They all went to university in the United Kingdom and settled here. I'm very proud of their achievements, and above all, that they are such good and kind human beings. My scientific work, I started off applying the methods that I'd learned in Oxford to research in Vienna, but the reactionary atmosphere in the department and the fact that they were really not friendly to women was very upsetting and unsatisfactory. So I, in the end, did mostly medical editorial work, correcting and often restructuring the papers of my colleagues, and especially the papers which were submitted to the main Austrian medical journal, the Wiener Klinische Wochenschrift. I often had to reject papers because it wasn't the English that was at fault, but the scientific content. And I think I made myself very unpopular in doing so because the authors thought that their papers had been accepted. And here I came along, of course, always having asked for help from a specialist in the subject. And the editor also got annoyed with me and said that with my criteria, he wouldn't be able to publish any paper. So I said, if it's wrong, it shouldn't be published. So it was certainly not what I had hoped to do with my wonderful British training. The only project which I undertook in all the years in Vienna, which gave me huge satisfaction and I felt was worthy of the training that I had been privileged to receive, was the cooperation with Hermann Brugger, a general practitioner and mountain rescue doctor in Bruneck in South Tyrol, Italy. In 1994, we published an article in the prestigious journal Nature on avalanche survival chances, which gave completely new guidelines on rescue procedure. And we followed this up with more papers on triage, field management of victims, and investigation of the underlying critical factors for survival. So hopefully lives have been saved due to this work. Brugger has now become director of the URAC Institute of Mountain Emergency Medicine in Bolzano, which is the first of its kind in the world. So this was a wonderful joint venture. Another cooperation which has brought me pleasure over the past 20 years was assisting Professor Paul Weindling at Oxford Brookes on the medical refugees who came to Britain in the 1930s, the doctors and scientists like my parents. How has Austria changed politically over the past 60 years? 50 years. Until 1985, Austria delighted in wallowing in the myth of being the first victims of Nazism. They totally ignored the second paragraph of the Moscow Declaration of 1943, which pointed out their responsibility for participation at the side of Nazi Germany during the war. So former members of the SS were actually members of parliament in all the political parties, especially the Freedom Party, and in all walks of life. Lesser war criminals were seldom convicted in Austrian courts, or if so, then given lenient sentences which were often commuted. Doctors were amongst the worst perpetrators. There was a notorious case of Heinrich Gross, psychiatrist in charge of the Spiegelgrund, which had a euthanasia program. He was complicit in the murder of so-called subnormal children. They were only children often who were difficult children, or in the case, there was one case of a child with rickets who were murdered. He evaded justice for years, and finally, when brought to court as an old man, his defense pleaded that he was unfit to stand trial or, due to early dementia, although his expert witness statements, highly paid, had been accepted in the same courts only a few years previously. Recent research by the doctor in Vienna recently implicates Asperger, who referred children from the university hospital to the Spiegelgrund. He must have known of the euthanasia program, which was carried out there, and should have prevented his children from being sent to the Spiegelgrund. He was complicit, therefore, in murder. The watershed occurred in 1986 with the Waldheim affair. The former Secretary General of the United Nations stood for election for presidency in Austria. There were accusations in Austria and abroad that he had lied about his war service. He said that he had been invalided out of the war in 1942 and was a law student at Edinburgh University, whilst indeed he was an officer in a German army unit which was responsible for atrocities in Yugoslavia, and also had been close to Thessaloniki and must have known of the tragic deportation of all the Greek Jews from there. The controversy over this had two divergent results. One was an increase in anti-Semitism in Austria. On the other hand, huge daily protests by young Austrians who demanded research on the Jews in Austria and investigation of Austria's participation in war crimes. In 1991, Chancellor Vranitzky spoke in the Austrian parliament and stated for the first time that the Austrians must recognize that they are responsible for the active participation of Austrians in National Socialist crimes. He repeated this in the Knesset 2 years later, and for the first time, Teddy Kollek found that it was possible for him to return to Vienna. He had not been back since he left in 1938. There was a reception in the Rathaus, in the town hall, which Georg and I were privileged to attend. And it was special to hear Teddy Kollek giving a wonderful speech. In 1998, 6 years after the Anschluss, there were threats to boycott the gastroenterology conference, Congress in Vienna. Professor Schütz, who was the dean-elect of the medical faculty and my big boss, he was professor of pharmacology, asked for my help with research to try and show that the Vienna medical faculty was looking into their past so that the Congress could take place. There was a day-long conference on the role of the medical faculty in the dismissal of the university docent and professors in medicine. It was attended by the Chancellor of Austria and also by the very special Cardinal König. He was the Archbishop of Vienna, an absolutely wonderful friend of the Jews. I was asked to help. Also, I was the joint editor of the Wiener Klinische Wochenschrift for a special edition of papers documenting this, also the medical faculty's role. More recently, in March 2018, 80 years after the Anschluss, there was also a Congress, 2 days of lectures on the after effects of the Anschluss on medicine and society. At the exhibition, I was asked to lend documents and also comment. In 2019, last year, in Erlach, where my great-grandfather had built the synagogue, the mayor, he opened a new museum of contemporary history. And the first exhibition was dedicated to the Jews of the region and their annihilation. The wonderful Austrian curator, Martha Keil, did a wonderful job. It was the first attempt to focus on the effects of National Socialism in the Austrian countryside. And one room will remain as permanently dedicated to the history of my own family. So I must point out that there have been these attempts to dispel amnesia and denial of Austria's role in the Holocaust. My husband sadly died in 2012. So I returned to Britain. It was home again. I was so happy to be close to my 3 sons and their lovely wives, the daughters that I didn't have the hassle of bringing up. And I'm so happy to be actively involved in all kinds of ways with my lovely 8 grandchildren, 4 boys and 4 girls. They are my total pride and joy. And moreover, they represent my personal victory over Hitler, who wished to annihilate us. I relish socializing now again with all my old friends in the United Kingdom, and I'm simply thrilled to have made some lovely new friends, thus filling a huge vacuum during my Vienna years. I love playing my neglected cello again, and before lockdown, I was so excited to be playing in 2 orchestras again. I should like to express my gratitude to Rabbi Shlomo Levine, Rebbitzin Lindy, and all the Levine family for the spiritual home which they have given me at South Hampstead, and also the welcoming community where one is greeted with a smile. Refugees are often asked where they consider home. I should like to quote finally from Krebs' speech in 1965, when he handed over the check of £90,000 collected from the refugees as a thank you to Britain. The proceeds of this fund were handed to the president of the British Academy. And Krebs said, we all went through the experience that home is not always where one was born and brought up. Home is where one strikes roots, where one has the opportunity of doing the things which, by virtue of inclination or conscience, or some other forces deep down in one's soul, one feels one ought to do in order to fulfill one's life and thereby gain true happiness. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Liesl. That was an absolutely riveting tale. For people who didn't know it, I'm sure it was very engrossing, very interesting, and I'm sure there will be some questions. Please wave your hand if you have one.
Unmute.
And unmute yourself, please.
No questions.
I've got a question. Liesl?
Yes.
Being a physicist, I'm particularly interested in Max Born. Could you, for those who don't know, Max Born was one of the 4 or 5 founders of quantum physics. Just tell me, in your experience, what kind of a person was he?
I just remember him as a lovely, to me, old gentleman, but he was probably ever so much younger than I am today. He was delightful, and he really modest, and he'd come, and I just remember him, as I said, as a brilliant pianist. And I have one story with him I remember very well. My parents invited both, I'm hardly answering your question, because of course as a child, he didn't talk about physics in our house, I'm afraid. He was just a really special person. And remember so well, my parents invited him along with her chief, who was Professor Gaddam at the time, famous pharmacologist, and his very academic, very stiff wife. And Max Born's wife, who was, I think, a Quaker, also very active, I think, in the refugee committee, which my mother was also on, but she was the chairwoman of the committee. And in the conversation, all of a sudden she said, I think that my husband has hardly any foreign accent. And there was a silence. When she said, what do you think, Lady Gaddam? And Lady Gaddam, who was very tall and stiff, got up to her whole height like this and could hardly get the words out of her mouth, saying, well, hardly. So I'm sorry, I haven't perhaps answered, but his son, Gustav Born, was a very fine flautist. And years later, I met him when he came to Vienna. It was funny. I think I picked him up and his wife. They were wanting to buy some flowers or something. And I gave them a lift in my car, and I think I just bought some very smelly cheese and was very embarrassed, I think. I didn't know who they were. I just heard them, him and his wife speaking English. And I took them then to a flower shop, and they got their flowers and everything. But of course, it turned out somehow he said, well, you know, where do you come from? And I said, Edinburgh. He said, so do I. And of course, we then, and Oxford, we cottoned on. And I have played chamber music actually myself in Vienna with Gustav Born, who knew my mother very well because my mother also was in pharmacology. But those are just stories.
Liesl, has the music or the medicine gone down to the next generation?
Well, they're all very fond of music, and Robbie, of course, blows the shofar. I must say, I don't usually praise my children, but I mean, the way he blows shofar is just fantastic. And he, I think he now blows, he used to blow at South Hampstead, and there is actually a lovely story about that. But just to finish, he also blows at Norris Lee every year, and somebody complained, and he said, you take all the excitement out of it that usually one has, because usually one is worried as to whether the shofar blower is going to be able to get a sound out, and you take away all my excitement. But Robbie, actually at South Hampstead, it was amazing. When he was blowing for several years, and even after they moved, he walked with the family on Rosh Hashanah. And when Sigalia, his older daughter, was a baby, she was in his arms, and he was blowing the shofar with one hand, because all the men folk in the family didn't seem to notice what was going on. And of course, although Ellie Levine tried to take the baby from him, she was having none of it. And it was only when Sarah went downstairs and, you know, sort of said to the men, all the men folk in the family, they were just doing nothing until Ernst, then the youngest, I think, ran up and took the baby off his hand. But he actually blew quite a lot of the blasts on the shofar. He also was a wonderful trumpeter. The others, Ernst played the violin and flute, Peter played the clarinet, and it has gone down to the next generation. They play violin, piano, Raphael the eldest trumpet. I hope that, and the lovely thing is, I think they sit down at the piano and play music. It's often, you know, modern music from at least young people's music. I won't even say, because I don't know what rap or what anything else is, so yes.
Neville, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you so much for that very interesting talk and your reminiscence of your life between Edinburgh and Vienna. And there was a play that came out in the West End just before lockdown called Leopoldstrasse by Tom Stoppard. And
Yes.
it's a magnificent play, and I do hope it will come back and you'll all be able to see it. But I mean, it was really, it told the problems. In some way, it kind of got over the point that really the Jews are never accepted. You know, I mean, no matter the situation that one says, okay, you know, we apologize for the past, we are regretful, but somehow Jews are different. And my wife has been mentioning to me that when we went on a wonderful art trip to Vienna to see the work of Klimt on the 200th anniversary of Klimt, this wonderful, great Viennese artist, we were actually appalled that there was a statue in the center of Vienna of an old man leaning on the floor and cleaning the dirt and leaves from the floor. It was a statue that the Viennese still leave there, and we find it kind of heartbreaking, though, that we're not certain, you know, that really the Austrians, you know, and therefore the Austrians, in quotes, the Germans, really ever accept the Jews as an equal party. So what would you like to comment on that? Thank you so much.
Yes, I do agree. It is very controversial, that particular sculpture that you mention. There have of course been now, there is the Rachel Whiteridge, the memorial to the Holocaust, and they're now building a wall which is going to contain all the names of every Austrian Jew who perished in the Holocaust.
Be a very large wall then, won't it?
Yes, 1/3 roughly, 65,000 roughly of Jews Austrian Jews were murdered. I mean, to be fair, are we ever accepted totally by anybody, any nation? I mean, I explain my difficulty in Austria. I'm sure there are many who are still anti-Semitic. To be fair, I don't know whether there are more in Austria today than in other countries. There has been an increase in anti-Semitism, sadly, in Austria, like other countries, which partly comes from the right and partly, sadly, from the Muslims. The Austrians had, at a very early stage, so-called guest workers from, at that time, Yugoslavia, and they're apparently the descendants and so on. It's one region where anti-Semitism comes from. But I have met in recent years, and therefore had to admit that the people who are now, perhaps they were young, now middle-aged, in Austria, there are Austrians who genuinely wish to look into the Austrians' past and take it very seriously, like the Martha Keil, who a wonderful lady in charge of a Jewish institute, part of Vienna University. Even back the professor Schubert, who was her teacher, he was a student at Vienna University at the time of the war finished, and was one of those students who was very active in the last few days of the war at Vienna University. It was very dangerous. There were still people shot in Vienna on the day, the VE Day, or just the day before. And he already declared Vienna University with a other group of students that are neutral. So there are many Austrians who genuinely want to try and make amends. It's too late, of course, and the financial reparations, or I don't know what you'd like to call it, a token that the Nationalfonds was founded about 15 years ago to give compensation to the descendants. But of course, it was the people who were thrown out who had to rebuild their lives and were often not well off. They should have been compensated, like happened in Germany. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that.
Liesl, I'm afraid we've run out of time now. Thank you so much for an absolutely fascinating talk this morning. We really enjoyed it.